I still remember the smell of fresh chalk and lemon-scented cleaner that filled Ms. Harrington's classroom that autumn morning. 7th grade was supposed to be my year, the year I finally broke out of my shell and showed everyone what I was capable of. But instead, I found myself standing in front of her desk, my knees trembling beneath my pleated uniform skirt, as she slid my algebra test across the wooden surface with 2 fingers, as if it were contaminated. "Care to explain this, Zora?" she asked, her thin lips barely moving. The bright red A+ at the top of the page should have been cause for celebration. Instead, it felt like an accusation. I was 12 years old, and in that moment, I learned that sometimes excellence isn't celebrated equally. The classroom had emptied 15 minutes ago, but Ms. Harrington had asked me to stay behind with a curt, "We need to discuss your test," that made my stomach twist into knots. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the room, highlighting the dust particles floating between us like tiny accusations. "I don't understand what you mean," I said quietly, my fingers fidgeting with the hem of my cardigan. "I studied really hard for this test." Miss Harrington leaned back in her chair, arms crossed over her chest. She was in her 40s with ash blonde hair always pulled into a tight bun and reading glasses that hung from a beaded chain around her neck. For the past 2 months since school started, I'd tried desperately to impress her, raising my hand for every question, turning in immaculate assignments, but nothing seemed to crack the thin ice of her skepticism. "Zora," she said, sighing as if my very existence was exhausting, "you've been a C-average student since the beginning of the term, and suddenly you score 98% on the most difficult test I've given this semester, the highest grade in the class." Her emphasis on "you" made my cheeks burn. I knew what she wasn't saying. "I studied every night for 2 weeks, I insisted, my voice growing smaller with each word. "My mom helped me. We went through every practice problem in the textbook." Miss Harrington picked up my test again, flipping through the pages with a theatrical skepticism that made my heart sink further. "Your work here is suspiciously similar to Jeremy Whitman's. Same approaches, same notation." Jeremy sat 2 seats, away from me. He was the son of a mathematics professor at the local university. He had always been the star student, the one teachers pointed to as an example. He was also white. "We use the same textbook," I said, feeling tears threatening, but forcing them back. Mom always told me never to give people the satisfaction of seeing me cry when they underestimated me. "And you taught us these methods." Miss Harrington removed her glasses, letting them hang from their chain. "Listen, Zora, I've been teaching for 23 years. I know when a student's work doesn't match their capabilities. I'm not accusing you of anything." But she was. We both knew it. "I just want to be fair to everyone. I'm going to have you retake the test tomorrow, under my supervision, during lunch." The injustice of it hit me like a physical blow. "But I didn't cheat," I whispered, my voice cracking despite my best efforts. "This isn't up for discussion," she said, already turning to her computer, dismissing me. "Tomorrow at lunch. And Zora? I'd suggest you use tonight to review the material again, thoroughly." The walk home that day was the longest of my life. Maple trees lined our neighborhood streets, their leaves a brilliant tapestry of orange and red that seemed to mock my dark mood. Normally I'd collect the prettiest ones to press between wax paper, but that day I kicked through them, watching them crumble beneath my feet. Our house was the smallest on Sycamore Street, but Mom had painted the door a bright yellow that she said reminded her of sunshine and possibilities. Usually that door filled me with comfort. That day, it just reminded me of all the ways I didn't fit in at Westbrook Preparatory Academy where most of my classmates lived in houses 3 times the size of ours. Mom was working her second shift at the hospital, so the house was empty when I arrived. I dropped my backpack by the door and slumped onto our worn sofa, finally allowing the tears to come. They felt hot on my cheeks, fueled by anger as much as hurt. Our coffee table was covered with the evidence of my studying. Notebooks filled with practice problems, flashcards with formulas, and the library books on advanced algebra that Mom had helped me check out. 2 weeks of staying up late, of Mom quizzing me between her shifts as a nurse, of believing that if I just worked hard enough, I could prove I belonged at Westbrook, despite being one of only 7 black students in my grade. The scholarship that had gotten me into Westbrook was supposed to be my ticket to opportunities my mom never had. Education is the one thing they can never take away from you, she always said. But sitting there, staring at the fruits of my labor that apparently weren't enough to convince Ms. Harrington, I wondered if that was true. I must have fallen asleep because the next thing I knew, Mom was gently shaking my shoulder. The living room was dark, except for the glow of the porch light filtering through our curtains. "Zora, baby, what are you doing sleeping out here?" Her voice was soft but concerned. Even after a 12-hour shift, she looked put together, her scrubs wrinkle-free, her braids tucked neatly into a bun. Only the faint shadows under her eyes betrayed her exhaustion. I sat up, my cheeks still tight from dried tears. "I got an A+ on my algebra test," I said flatly. Mom's face broke into a wide smile, revealing the gap between her front teeth that I'd inherited. "That's wonderful. All that studying paid off." She sat beside me, then paused, noticing my expression. "Why aren't you happy about it?" The whole story poured out of me then. Miss Harrington's accusation, the comparison to Jeremy, the demanded retest. As I spoke, I watched Mom's expression change from confusion to a controlled anger I rarely saw. Her jaw tightened, and she took several deep breaths through her nose. When I finished, she was quiet for so long that I feared she was disappointed in me. Finally, she took my hands in hers, her palms warm and slightly rough from constant hand-washing at the hospital. "Zora Elise Morgan," she said, using my full name in that way that always commanded my full attention. "I have never been more proud of you than I am right now." I blinked in surprise. "But Ms. Harrington thinks I cheated." "And what do you know?" she asked. "That I didn't," I said immediately. "That's right. You know your truth. You worked for that grade, and no one can take that knowledge away from you." She squeezed my hands. "Now, we have 2 choices. You can retake that test tomorrow and ace it again, showing Ms. Harrington exactly what you're capable of, or—" Mom's eyes took on that determined glint that usually preceded her taking on extra shifts to pay for something I needed, or confronting the landlord about the broken heater in the middle of winter. "I can go to school with you tomorrow and have a conversation with Ms. Harrington about why she assumes my daughter, who has been studying algebra until midnight for 2 weeks straight, couldn't possibly earn the highest grade in class honestly." I felt a flutter of both hope and anxiety. "Would you really go to school with me?" Mom smiled, but it wasn't her usual warm smile. This one had an edge of steel to it. "Baby, I have fought too hard to get you into that school, to let anyone, teacher or otherwise, make you doubt yourself. That night, instead of reviewing algebra as Miss Harrington had suggested, Mom helped me gather every piece of evidence of my studying. We collected my practice tests, the notebook where I'd worked out every problem in the textbook, even the flashcards I'd made. Mom also dug out a file from her bedroom drawer, one I'd never seen before. "What's that?" I asked as she placed it on the dining table. "Just some paperwork you might need someday," she said cryptically. "Now get some sleep. Tomorrow's going to be a long day." I didn't sleep much that night. I kept replaying Miss Harrington's words, her dismissive tone, the way she'd looked at me as if I couldn't possibly be capable of excellence. By morning, my fear had hardened into determination. Whatever happened, I wouldn't let her make me feel small again. Mom called into her shift, something she almost never did. She wore her navy blue dress, the one reserved for special occasions and parent-teacher conferences, and styled her braids in an elegant updo. I noticed she also put on the pearl earrings that had belonged to my grandmother. "We're not going to war, Mom," I said, as we walked to the car, though her formal appearance made me feel like we were heading into battle. "No," she agreed, adjusting her pearl earrings. "But we are going to teach someone an important lesson about assumptions." Westbrook Preparatory Academy had been built in the 1870s, all red brick and ivy, with tall windows and an imposing entrance flanked by stone columns. Usually I felt a mixture of pride and intimidation walking through those doors. That day, with Mom beside me, I felt something different. Resolve. We arrived an hour before classes started. The hallways were quiet, with only a few teachers preparing for the day. Mom walked with purpose, her heels clicking on the polished floors as we made our way to Miss Harrington's classroom. She was there as I expected, writing the day's agenda on the whiteboard. She turned at the sound of our entrance, her expression shifting from surprise to a practiced pleasantness when she saw my mother. "Mrs. Morgan, what a surprise. I don't believe we had a meeting scheduled." "We don't," Mom said, her voice warm but firm. "But after what Zora told me yesterday, I thought it was important we talk before classes begin." Miss Harrington's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. She put down her marker and gestured to the student desks. "Of course. Please, have a seat." "I'd prefer to stand, thank you," Mom said, placing a protective hand on my shoulder. "Zora tells me you've accused her of cheating on her algebra test." Miss Harrington's eyes widened slightly. "I wouldn't say accused, Mrs. Morgan. I simply expressed concern about the sudden improvement in her performance and suggested a supervised retest to confirm her understanding. A retest that none of the other students who performed well are being asked to take," Mom pointed out. "Well, Zora's improvement was particularly dramatic because she worked particularly hard," Mom countered, opening her tote bag. She pulled out the stack of practice tests and notebooks we'd collected the night before. "This is how my daughter spent the last 2 weeks. Every night after I came home from my shift, we studied together until midnight. These are her practice tests, her notes, the additional problems she worked through." Miss Harrington glanced at the materials without touching them. "Mrs. Morgan, I appreciate a parent who supports their child's education, but—" "I'm not finished," Mom said, her tone remaining respectful but brooking no interruption. She pulled out the file I'd seen the night before. "Do you remember when Zora applied to Westbrook last year?" Miss Harrington blinked at the sudden change of subject. "I wasn't involved in admissions, but yes, I'm aware she's on scholarship." "A full academic scholarship," Mom clarified, "awarded to only 2 students in the entire district. Do you know why Zora received it?" Without waiting for an answer, Mom opened the file and removed several papers, placing them on Miss Harrington's desk. "These are Zora's standardized test scores from last year. She scored in the 99th percentile nationally in mathematics. Her aptitude tests placed her 4 grade levels above her age in analytical thinking." I stared at my mother, in shock. I knew I'd done well on those tests, but she had never shared the specific results with me. Miss Harrington picked up the papers, her eyebrows rising as she scanned them. For the first time since I'd known her, she seemed genuinely speechless, Mom continued, her voice steady but intense. My daughter has been performing below her capabilities in your class, Ms. Harrington, not above them. And I have to wonder why a student who clearly has exceptional mathematical ability would suddenly start underperforming when she entered your classroom. The implication hung in the air between them. Miss Harrington's cheeks flushed pink. I was not aware of these assessment results, she said finally, placing the papers down carefully. They weren't in her student file. Because I requested they not be shared with teachers initially, Mom explained. I wanted Zora to have a chance to be known for her character and daily work, not just test numbers. I wanted her to learn at her own pace without pressure, but I never imagined that when she finally did perform to her ability, she would be accused of dishonesty. Miss Harrington looked from Mom to me, then back to the test scores. Something shifted in her expression. Not quite remorse, but a recalibration. I see, she said quietly. Do you? Mom asked. Because what my daughter sees is that when she finally excels, her achievement is questioned in a way that other students' achievements are not. Mrs. Morgan, if I've made an error in judgment, you have, Mom said simply. And now you have an opportunity to correct it. The classroom fell silent except for the tick of the wall clock and the distant sounds of students beginning to arrive for the day. I watched Ms. Harrington's face as she processed everything. The evidence of my studying, the test scores that contradicted her assumptions about me, and the dignified but unmistakable challenge in my mother's stance. Finally, she turned to me. Zora, it appears I've underestimated you. I apologize for questioning your integrity. The apology felt both momentous and insufficient. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. I'd like to suggest an alternative to the retest, she continued, addressing both of us now. Given these assessment scores, perhaps Zora would benefit from more advanced work than what we're covering in class. I could provide supplemental materials, maybe even discuss with the administration about placement in the 8th grade algebra class. Mom looked at me, letting me know the decision was mine. I thought about it for a moment, then shook my head. I want to stay in this class, I said, finding my voice. I want to learn alongside my classmates, but I don't want to be treated differently because of your expectations about what I can or can't do. Miss Harrington nodded slowly. That's fair. More than fair. And what about the A+ on my test? I asked. Does it stand? Yes, she said. You earned it. Mom squeezed my shoulder gently, a silent message of pride. I think we should also discuss this incident with Principal Grayson, she added. Not to escalate matters, but to ensure there's a record of what happened and how it was resolved. Miss Harrington's lips thinned slightly, but she nodded. Of course. We can go to his office now, before classes start. As we walked toward the administrative wing, the hallways were beginning to fill with students. I spotted several of my classmates, including Jeremy Whitman, who gave me a curious look as we passed. For once, I didn't shrink under the attention. I walked tall beside my mother, feeling a new kind of confidence taking root. Principal Grayson was a tall man with salt and pepper hair and a reputation for fairness. He listened attentively as Miss Harrington explained the situation. To her credit, she didn't minimize her error. And then as Mom presented our perspective and the evidence of my academic capabilities. I'm troubled by this misunderstanding, he said when they finished. Westbrook prides itself on recognizing and nurturing talent wherever we find it. He turned to me. Zora, I want to personally apologize that your achievement was questioned inappropriately. That's not what we stand for. Thank you, I said, surprised by the firmness in my own voice. He turned to Ms. Harrington. I think this calls for some reflection on our implicit biases and how they might affect our expectations of students. In fact, I'm going to suggest to the board that we implement additional professional development on this topic for all faculty. Ms. Harrington nodded, her expression carefully neutral. I think that would be valuable. And as for you, Zora, Principal Grayson continued, I'm impressed not just by your academic ability, but by your grace under pressure. Those are qualities that will serve you well throughout your life. As we left his office, the first bell rang, signaling 5 minutes until classes would begin. Mom hugged me tightly in the hallway, not caring who saw. Remember what I said last night, she whispered. No one can take your knowledge away from you, and no one can make you feel inferior without your consent. I recognized the second part as a quote from Eleanor Roosevelt that hung on our refrigerator at home. It had never felt more relevant. I'll pick you up after school, Mom said, straightening my collar. We'll celebrate that A+ properly. As I watched her walk away, I felt a new kind of strength settling into my bones. I turned and headed to Ms. Harrington's class, no longer dreading what awaited me there. Word had somehow spread among my classmates. Perhaps Jeremy had overheard something. Or maybe another teacher had been in the hallway during our conversation. When I entered the classroom, several students looked at me with new interest. Tiffany Wu, one of the few girls who had been consistently friendly to me, gave me a thumbs up from her seat. Miss Harrington was already at her desk, more subdued than usual. She looked up as I entered, and I held her gaze steadily until she looked away first. I took my seat, removed my notebook and pencil, and waited for class to begin. For the first time since starting at Westbrook, I felt like I truly belonged there. Not because someone else had approved of me, but because I had stood up for my right to be recognized for my abilities. When Ms. Harrington returned our graded tests at the end of class, mine was on top of the stack, the A+ now accompanied by a note. Excellent work. See me about joining the Math Olympiad team. It wasn't quite an olive branch, but it was an acknowledgement. As promised, Mom was waiting, outside at dismissal time. We went for ice cream at Clarkson's Creamery, where I ordered a double scoop of butter pecan, my usual celebratory choice. To my brilliant daughter, Mom said, raising her cone in a toast. And to standing up for yourself. And to you, I added, clinking my cone against hers. For always believing in me, even when others don't. That evening, as we sat on our porch swing watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of pink and gold, I asked Mom a question that had been nagging at me. Do you think Miss Harrington will treat me differently now? Mom considered this gently, pushing the swing with her foot. Probably. People often do when their assumptions are challenged. But the real question is, how will you treat yourself? What do you mean? I mean, will you continue to hide your light, or will you let yourself shine without apology? I thought about how I'd been walking through the halls of Westbrook for months, trying to be invisible, trying not to draw attention to how different I was from most of my classmates, not just in the color of my skin, but in my background, my experiences, the size of my house, the jobs my mom worked. I think, I said slowly, I'm done with hiding. Mom smiled and wrapped an arm around my shoulders. That's my girl. The next day at school felt like stepping into a slightly altered reality. The building was the same. The students were the same, but I moved through it differently. Head high, voice clear when I answered questions in class, unafraid to demonstrate what I knew. In Miss Harrington's class, I noticed she called on me more often, especially for the most challenging problems. Whether this was her attempt at making amends or testing me further, I couldn't be sure. But I met each question with calm confidence. After a week of this new dynamic, she asked me to stay after class. An echo of the previous confrontation that made my stomach tighten despite myself. "Zora," she said when we were alone, "I wanted to let you know that the Math Olympiad team will be meeting on Thursdays after school. We could use someone with your analytical skills." I studied her face, looking for signs of insincerity or condescension, but found none. "I'll think about it," I said. She nodded, then hesitated. "I also wanted to say," she paused, seeming to choose her words carefully, "that watching you this past week has been educational for me. You're showing a confidence that I should have recognized and encouraged from the beginning." It wasn't exactly another apology, but there was a genuineness to her words that surprised me. "Thank you," I said. "I'm just being myself." "Well," she said with a small smile, "it suits you." I did join the Math Olympiad team, and to my surprise, I enjoyed it. Jeremy Whitman was on the team too, and after an initial awkwardness, we developed a respectful rivalry that pushed us both to excel. By the end of the school year, our team had placed second in the state competition, a Westbrook record. More importantly, I'd found my voice. I no longer hesitated to raise my hand in class or to challenge ideas I disagreed with. I made friends who appreciated me for who I was, not despite it. And when I occasionally encountered other teachers or students who seemed to expect less of me, I remembered Mom's words. "No one can make you feel inferior without your consent." Ms. Harrington remained strict but fair for the rest of the year. She never again questioned my abilities, and sometimes I caught her watching me with a thoughtful expression, as if I were a puzzle she was still trying to solve. But there was respect in her gaze now, however reluctantly given. The incident with my algebra test became a turning point not just for me, but for Westbrook itself. True to his word, Principal Grayson implemented training for faculty on recognizing and addressing implicit bias. The following year, the school established a diversity committee that included teachers, parents, and students. Mom was invited to join and, despite her busy schedule, accepted. On the last day of 7th grade, Ms. Harrington handed me my final report card personally. A+ was written next to algebra. "You've set a high bar for yourself next year," she said. I smiled. "I know, but I'm not afraid of high expectations anymore, especially my own." 15 years have passed since that day in Ms. Harrington's classroom. I have faced other challenges, other moments when people underestimated me or questioned my belonging. But none has shaped me quite like that first confrontation with injustice and the strength I found to overcome it. I went on to graduate from Westbrook as valedictorian, earn a scholarship to MIT, and eventually become a mathematics professor myself. I specialize in making advanced mathematical concepts accessible to students from all backgrounds, and I've published research on reducing achievement gaps in STEM education. Last month, I was invited back to Westbrook to give a talk to the students about my career path and research. The school had changed in many ways. The student body was more diverse, for one thing. But those imposing red brick buildings and ivy-covered walls still inspired the same mixture of awe and intimidation in me. After my presentation, Principal Grayson, now with fully silver hair, gave me a tour of the campus, pointing out new facilities and introducing me to current faculty. As we rounded a corner near the science wing, I almost collided with a woman carrying a stack of books. "So sorry," she began, then stopped abruptly as recognition dawned. Dr. Morgan. It took me a moment to place her. Miss Harrington had aged considerably, her once ash-blonde hair now silver, lines etched around her eyes and mouth, her posture slightly stooped. But those assessing eyes were the same. Miss Harrington, I said, extending my hand. It's been a long time. It certainly has, she replied, shifting her books to shake my hand. Though it's Mrs. Coleman now. I remarried some years ago. Principal Grayson excused himself for a meeting, leaving us alone in the hallway. I saw the announcement about your talk, she said. I'm sorry I missed it. My husband had a medical appointment. There was something different about her. A vulnerability that hadn't been there before. I noticed her hands trembling slightly as she adjusted her books. Is everything all right? I asked. She gave a tight smile. Oh, just the usual challenges of getting older. Thomas, my husband, has Parkinson's. I've cut back to part-time teaching to help care for him. I'm sorry to hear that, I said sincerely. She shrugged. Life gives us what it gives us. We adapt. She paused, studying me. You certainly did. What do you mean? Adapt, overcome, succeed, despite obstacles. She shifted her books again, looking slightly uncomfortable. I've followed your career, you know. Your papers on mathematical pedagogy have influenced how I teach now. I was genuinely surprised. Really? Yes. Your work on creating inclusive learning environments is, well, it's important. I wish I'd understood that better when you were my student. The admission hung between us, bridging 15 years of unspoken history. Would you have time for a cup of coffee? She asked suddenly. The faculty lounge has a decent machine now. Not like the sludge we used to serve. I checked my watch. My flight back to Boston wasn't until evening. Sure, I'd like that. As we walked to the lounge, she told me about her life since I'd been her student. Her late-in-life marriage to a kind man she'd met at a conference. Her continued passion for teaching, despite the education system's challenges. Her recent struggles balancing work with caregiving. In the lounge, as we sat with steaming cups of surprisingly good coffee, she finally addressed what we'd both been thinking about. I've owed you an apology for a long time, she said, her fingers wrapped around her mug. A real one, not the half-hearted acknowledgement I gave when your mother confronted me. That was a long time ago, I said, not to dismiss her words, but to acknowledge the distance we'd both traveled. Yes, but some lessons stay with us, don't they? She looked out the window where students were crossing the quad between classes. You taught me one of the most important lessons of my teaching career. Which was that excellence can come from unexpected places, if only we have eyes to see it. She turned back to me. After you, I became more careful about my assumptions, more attentive to quiet potential. I'd like to think I became a better teacher. I hope so, I said honestly. Do you remember Jeremy Whitman? She asked. I smiled. Of course. We were quite competitive in Math Olympiad. He's a hedge fund manager now. Very successful from what I hear. She took a sip of her coffee. But I recently saw an interview where he mentioned that his biggest regret was not pursuing pure mathematics, which was his true passion. Why didn't he? Expectations. His father's, society's, his own. She set down her mug. We all face expectations, don't we? But some of us have the additional burden of having to prove ourselves worthy of even having expectations placed on us at all. I nodded, touched by her insight. That's perceptive. I had a good teacher," she said with a small smile. "A 12-year-old girl who refused to let me define her capabilities. As our conversation wound down, she mentioned that she was looking for a tutor for several promising students whose families couldn't afford Westbrook's usual academic support services. I've been doing it myself, but with Thomas's condition worsening," she trailed off. "I might be able to help," I said, an idea forming. My research group has developed a virtual tutoring program specifically for underrepresented students in mathematics. We're looking for pilot schools. Her eyes lit up. "That would be extraordinary. These students have so much potential, they just need someone to see it and nurture it." "I know exactly what you mean," I said. We exchanged contact information, and I promised to send her details about the program. As we walked back toward the main entrance, students streamed past us, engrossed in their own dramas and dreams, just as I had been all those years ago. At the door, Mrs. Coleman, the teacher I would always think of as Miss Harrington, paused. "You know, watching you speak today, seeing the woman and scholar you've become, it made me proud," she said, "and a little ashamed that I ever doubted you." "We all have blind spots," I said. "The important thing is what we do once they're revealed to us." She nodded, then asked hesitantly, "How is your mother? She was quite formidable." I smiled broadly. "Still is. She went back to school herself after I left for college. She's a nurse practitioner now, running a community health clinic in our old neighborhood." "Please give her my regards," she said, "and my respect." As I left Westbrook that day, walking down the same stone steps I'd climbed as an anxious 7th grader, I thought about how a single moment of injustice, confronted with dignity and determination, had helped shape not just my life, but the lives of others who would come after me. I wonder sometimes what would have happened if Mom hadn't stood up for me that day. If we had simply accepted Miss Harrington's assumptions about my capabilities. Would I have continued to hide my abilities, to make myself smaller to fit others' expectations? Or would I have found another catalyst for embracing my potential? I'd like to think that the truth about who we are finds a way to emerge, regardless of obstacles. But I'm grateful I didn't have to find out. If you've ever been underestimated or had your abilities questioned unfairly, I hope you'll share your story. How did you respond? What would you have done in my place? Sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is simply refuse to accept the limitations others try to place on us. And if you know someone who needs to hear this message, whether they're facing their own Miss Harrington or questioning their own worth, please share this story with them. Remind them that no one can take their knowledge away, and no one can make them feel inferior without their consent. The greatest irony of life is how our challenges often become our greatest teachers. That day when Miss Harrington accused me of cheating became the very foundation for the work I do now, ensuring that every student, regardless of background, has their brilliance recognized and nurtured. And in helping her develop a program for the students she now champions, our story has come full circle in ways neither of us could have imagined. Sometimes the person who once stood in your way becomes the very reason you find your path. And sometimes, just sometimes, you get the chance to help them find theirs too.